Hi everybody, welcome. My name is Amy Ligenfelder and I'm currently an English Language Fellow in Quito, Ecuador. And today I'm here to talk about my topic, which is Every Picture Tells 1,000 Words, Teaching Language Through the Visual Arts. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. I'm really excited to talk about two great passions of mine, visual arts and language education, and ways to combine them both to facilitate language learning. On a side note, I'm actually an amateur artist myself, so this was one of the motivating factors for choosing this subject. Okay, next. Next. So I like to say that medicine feeds the body and education feeds the mind. And what do you think feeds the soul? I think some people would say love, some people would say God, and others might say the arts. And for me, that's definitely true. Next. So here are some quotes I like about art. The first one is, "The purpose of art is washing the dust of daily life off our souls," by the famous Pablo Picasso. And I really love this quote because that's sort of what it feels like for a lot of people to create art, to take all the negative things of life and be in the moment, fully enjoying what we are creating. Another quote that's very common is, "Art imitates life." And I'd like to sort of add to that by saying that art not only imitates our real lives, but it improves on it, adds to it, and it gives us a sort of better, different perspective on our lives. Next. And I fully believe that a great teacher is a great artist. And teaching is the greatest of the arts since the medium is the human mind and spirit rather than the brush, according to John Steinbeck, one of my favorite authors. I think that teaching is both an art and a science, but the art side of it is sort of using our creativity and what comes from inside us, what comes from our heart, what feels right in our classrooms, and using art can help us with this. And finally, a quote by Aristotle, "The aim of art is to represent not the outward appearance of things, but their inward significance." And as we know, when we learn language, when we teach language, we're teaching and learning the literal and the obvious meaning, the surface meaning, and also the deeper meaning. And the same thing applies to understanding and analyzing artwork, which can help students learn language. Okay, next. So what are the visual arts? Let's talk about that first. What are they? Define them. Next. So there's two types. There's two-dimensional images, things on paper, for example, oil, acrylic paintings, watercolor paintings, drawings, illustrated books, photography, murals. And then there's three-dimensional images, things that have texture and physical shape. For example, sculpture, pottery, jewelry, carvings, printmaking, and any other kinds of crafts. Next. Next, please. Try to say that a little bit louder. Okay, so the objectives for today will be teachers, or anyone who's tuning in, you will explore the benefits and strategies for teaching language through visual arts activities. And you will learn how to apply these strategies and ideas to make English more fun and engaging in the classroom. And art is usually fun, and it's important for the English classroom to be enjoyable because it increases student motivation. So that's very important. The next thing you'll learn is how to encourage and maximize communication in the classroom. And it's very important for students to be practicing conversation, communicating in English as much as possible, and art activities encourage communication. The third thing is you will learn how to teach about and explore English-speaking cultures, and you can do this through art. Art often represents the culture of the artist, and it's a great starting point for cultural lessons and discussions. And finally, we'll teach students to appreciate the arts and improve their art skills as well. Okay, next. Okay, so I'd like to get a little bit of feedback from people if we can, but I'm going to move along a little bit quickly for the sake of time and give you my own comments and opinions. But think about this. Do you agree or disagree with these statements? Number one, it's a waste of time to use visual arts as a learning tool in language classes. And I think some people might think it is. Think about that. What do you think? The truth is that the time students spend on art enhances learning and especially retention. And we'll discuss that more in detail a little bit later. Number 2, having skills in the visual arts is important in today's society. Well, unfortunately, many think that art is not important. For example, in many places like schools, art is the first subject to be cut when there are funding cuts in schools. But it's really important to expose students to a variety of activities, including those that improve visual skills, so they can make their own decision about their lives and what's important to them. So I would say, yes, it is important. And number 3, visual arts are fun for most children. Oh, excuse me, number 3. It's the teacher's job to make learning fun. It's definitely the teacher's job to create a classroom environment in which students enjoy and feel motivated about learning English. And yes, students do need to meet the teacher halfway in that process. So yes, in part, that is true. Number 4, visual arts are fun for most children. What do you think? I think that's a pretty obvious answer. Most children, especially younger children, love creative activities, and as long as students have freedom and autonomy and the teacher chooses the type of activity and the topic carefully, most students will enjoy it. Number 5, students need to learn the same concept in different ways in order to retain information. What do you think? Well, the answer is yes, for sure, and I will explain the science behind that in a bit more detail later. Number 6, visual arts only works with younger children. That's a very common misconception. Younger children definitely are more in touch with their creativity because they're more encouraged to use their creativity in a lot of different areas of their life. But that's false. Just because a person is older doesn't mean they should stop doing creative activities. All ages can enjoy art if given the right activities and if they have the confidence. Number 7, culture and society are best represented through the arts. As we know from other types of art like pop music, movies, literature, culture is represented in all forms of art, and it's a reflection of culture. Art is a reflection, and really art is no exception. So visualize this for a moment. Think about this activity. Just think about it in your mind for a minute. You can jot down some things on a piece of paper as I'm explaining it. Draw a picture of your hometown or something that reminds you of it, some sort of cue or some sort of memory from your hometown. It could be a house or a landscape or anything that reminds you of it. And I actually ask students to do this in a classroom, so that's why I'm using this as an example. So in number 2, in a language that's not your first, try to describe the drawing in that language. So try to describe the steps you're taking to draw the image with your classmates or with somebody maybe sitting next to you, the things it contains in the artwork. Try to describe a story behind it, maybe something that, a memory from your childhood in your hometown, and then try to describe why you chose that subject and what it means to you. And then thinking about this, think about, was there any language that you didn't know or you don't know in this second language that could make this process easier? So think about that for a minute. Okay, and we're going to talk about strategies to teach this in a couple minutes. So why should we use visual arts to teach a second language? The question is why. Why is it important? Okay, moving on. Next. Thanks. So the benefits of using visual arts to teach a second language, the first one is very scientific. Research about the brain suggests that it's very important to teach language in multiple ways. Teach anything in multiple ways, but especially language. And one way you can do this is through the 5 senses. So sight, smell, sound, taste, and touch. Another way is by creating cross-curricular connections. Art is a cross-curricular connection. You can also teach language through history, science, or any other subject, and that helps with learning and retention. And finally, teaching language in multiple ways, it activates more dendritic pathways of the brain, as you can see from this beautiful photo here, big close-up of neurons of the brain, as they're called. The more neurons that are activated, the more parts of the brain that are used. And then next. So when more parts of the brain are used or activated, more parts store data about just one piece of information. And as a result, a person fully learns and retains the information instead of just memorizing and forgetting it, 2 minutes later or after the test, as I'm sure you've had experience with that in the past, and I know I have. So some more benefits. Art is important to language learning because students learn through various ways and learn through various senses. So it stimulates multiple parts of the brain, which leads to stronger memory, stronger retention. Students, it's lasting learning. That's what we're focusing on here. And I like to use the expression that it kisses the brain. Any learning experience that is enjoyable, memorable, and it lasts for a long time, that kisses the brain. Okay, next. Okay, some of you might be aware of Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Art makes use of almost all of them, and this theory claims that everyone has one or a combination of different types of intelligences, and that the classroom should activate all of these at some point throughout the lesson, throughout the day, or throughout the unit. The first one that's an obvious example is spatial intelligence. You can see from the purple, it's kind of hard to see it in this document, but the purple square in the bottom. Spatial intelligence is intelligence for seeing things and creating visual things. And art is the most obvious use of this, of course. The next type is bodily kinesthetic intelligence, and that's in the green. And that's intelligence for movement and using hands and action, learning by doing. And art activities automatically utilize this throughout the creation of the entire activity because they're using their hands. Interpersonal intelligence in yellow, interpersonal intelligence in red, is intelligence about self, knowledge of self, and one's own thoughts and feelings. And art helps students explore this because art is personal. And it allows students to sort of explore their inner selves, their inner thoughts and feelings, and it sort of express them in a safe way. Linguistic intelligence, which is in orange, is intelligence about words. People that are strong in this area are good at reading and writing, love to read, and they love language. And art activities that encourage reading and written communication are important for this, and we'll discuss this in a bit later. And then finally, interpersonal, which is in yellow, is sort of social skills. It's intelligence for interacting with others, art activities that encourage students to interact with others and speak to others in English, use this skill. Okay, next. Okay, so using art also makes use of three main learning styles. Visual, learning by seeing or reading something. Auditory, learning by hearing something. And kinesthetic, learning by doing or practicing something. So any art activity that encourages communication makes use of all of these learning styles. Okay, next. So another benefit of art is that it contextualizes and illustrates the English concept that is being taught. When I was studying journalism in university, the professors always said, show, not tell, show, not tell, show, not tell through your writing. Don't tell the reader, but show. And art just naturally shows, and it contextualizes the meaning of anything that you're teaching. So as you can see from this picture, this beautiful picture of this woman in the sunlight and the word happy next to it, you can see instead of explaining what happy means, the image below shows a woman feeling very happy, and you don't have to say more, really. Another thing is that art imitates and enhances student. Oh, go back. Sorry. Oh, thanks. It imitates and enhances student reality. So students may have, a lot of negative things going on in their lives, and art can sort of take these aspects in their lives and make them appear or feel better, make them more interesting, more positive, at least for the moment. Art also incorporates all aspects of language, listening, reading, speaking, writing, and more specifically, vocabulary and grammar. And finally, it can be used to teach almost any language topic or skill, and I'll explain that a bit later in more detail. Next. And if anyone has any pressing questions throughout, just feel free to ask. Okay, and finally, art is so open to interpretation that it generates endless ideas and endless language. So you take one image, painting, whatever, one image, 500 people are viewing it, 500 people are viewing it in 500 different ways, just like however many people are viewing this are processing this differently. So an image generates very individual responses that can motivate students to produce a large amount of language and very freely. And despite what you might think, it's easy and practical to implement. You don't need expensive art materials. You can choose to do that, but if you don't have the funds for that, or you don't have the room or whatever, just a pencil and paper is enough for many activities. And finally, it makes English learning fun, as I explained before. That is crucial to the language classroom. Okay, next. Art, very important. Art also encourages creative and individual free expression, and they can express their feelings safely. They can express their feelings in a safe way. I know that a lot of students are shy, or especially shy to speak English, and art is a way of sort of taking them out of their shell and communicating what's inside. And as a result, it encourages motivation and learner autonomy. And as I said before, art is a very personal activity, and it allows students to take full ownership of their work. And when they do that, as a result, they take full ownership of their language learning, which is important. Finally, students can create their own fantasy worlds through art, as you can see from this beautiful sort of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the game Candyland, but it sort of reminds me of that. I had a student provide this as their dream world, and they said they wanted to be able to eat everything in sight because the student loved to eat. So as you can see from this photo, it doesn't have to be similar to their true realities. So you might, yeah, you can, next is good. So you might be familiar with the expression, every picture tells 1,000 words, which is so true. I love this example. You might be familiar with this famous picture first published in National Geographic of a beautiful Afghani woman with stunning green eyes. They show her younger, and then they show her older. And I don't think she's that much older, actually. But you can tell from her face at both ages what a difficult life she's had. And just showing this image, you could write a book about this woman's life story just based on this photo. Okay, next. You might be familiar with this, this artwork by the famous Spanish artist Salvador Dali. It's called The Persistence of Memory. It can communicate so much about time and memory, and again, you can write a book about, or you can speak for hours about what this painting might mean. Okay, next. This is, as you know, I'm living in Ecuador, and I'm in the hometown of the famous Ecuadorian painter Osvaldo Guayasamín. And this is one of my favorite paintings by him. He clearly shows the strong love and tenderness between mother and child. And again, it could generate endless discussion, endless ideas, endless writing as well. Okay, next. So let's talk about how we can use visual arts to teach English. How can we do this? There's two main ways. Next. The first way is through the process of creating their own images. So it's sort of like a hybrid art and language class. And you can determine how much time you want students to dedicate to the art, to creating the art, and how much time you want them to dedicate to practicing English and teaching English. So the first way they can learn through creating their own images is understanding the process of how to complete the work. So for example, the teacher assigns an art assignment and explains how to do it using English. The teacher will teach the language that the students must use to understand the process to complete the work. For example, if they're working on clay pottery, they have to learn the language squeeze the clay, form the clay. They have to learn the word clay. Paintbrush, shadow, when you're creating shadows on the sides of things to create depth. Charcoal, anything that is required for understanding how to complete the artwork. Second thing is communicating this process with classmates and teachers. I'm sure you remember from many art classes you've taken that it's when students are working, they love to speak. And you can really enforce in the classroom that students are speaking with each other and speaking about this process of completing the artwork in English. And you can teach them, pre-teach the language they need to do this. For example, the present progressive. Oh, I am shading this person's face right now. And you can make sure that they're using this language as they're working. Also important is when they're finished with their work, explaining and describing their work, and they need the language to do that, the grammar, the vocab, and I'll talk about a bit later when they have a final art show, they need language to be able to explain that and describe it. Finally, illustrating. Illustration is a huge segment, or a huge component of teaching English through arts. For example, illustrating the meaning of a vocabulary word, and or a children's fiction story. There's so many different examples. Okay, next. The second way is students learn and practice English by using other people's images for analysis and description. So the teacher would bring artistic images to the classroom, or the students can discuss other classmates' work of art, as you can see from this photo. And you probably already do this in your classrooms now. Okay, next. So, any work, or almost any work I should say, can be created or displayed in a language class, and it can be used to do the following for any language topic, any language point you're teaching. Practice it, express it, describe it, and illustrate it. Okay, and the above can be done in both spoken form and written form. So an example of spoken form would be conversations or oral presentations, and an example of written form would be paragraphs and narrative stories. So the themes of artwork should be based on students' real lives and backgrounds, almost always, because I don't know if you probably use this already in your class, but any topic in a language class should be relevant to students' real lives. They should be able to relate to it. If they can relate to that topic, for example, Justin Bieber is their favorite artist, and they have to do an art activity related to Justin Bieber. This increases motivation and ownership of learning. Or another example, as I gave before, students drawing a picture of their hometown. Again, it's personal, and it really increases motivation and engagement in the class as a result. Another suggestion that I have when students are creating the artwork in the classroom, that you do language mini lessons prior to the art activity or during, at strategic points during the activity. It's really important. I would suggest about no more than 20 minutes per mini lesson, and whatever language students need to work on that activity, they're ready to do it immediately, and they're immediately applying it in the activity. Something that's very important is a summative presentation, a final presentation, final art show, as you can see from the photo here, using the learned language points. So a language topic you taught in the classroom in order for students to complete the work. For example, the past simple tense. They had to write about, or they had to draw an image of something that happened to them 5 years ago, and they had to use the past simple tense to do that. In their final art show, to the class or to whoever wants to see it, they have to use that. They have to use the past simple tense in their art show when they're explaining. Okay, next. Okay, so think about at least 3 language points that could be taught through the process of students creating their own artwork. I did mention quite several before. Can you give me some other ideas quickly? What do you think? Anyone have anything to share? Okay, I'm going to move on. You can go to the next one. No responses. Okay, no problem. Okay, so go to the next one. So artwork can be used to teach a variety of grammar points and vocabulary, anything, including colors, shapes, sizes. Those are some of the obvious ones. Locations, for example, park, desert, street. Prepositions of all kinds, for example, under, above, next to. Adjectives, adjectives is a very obvious example because when students are describing their work, they have to use adjectives to describe it. For example, tall, wide, beautiful, happy, anything that you'd like. Verbs is something that might not be as obvious, but if there is action taking place in the artwork, students need the language to be able to describe this action, or they need the verbs to describe the actions needed to create the art. So if they're working in groups and they're describing what they're doing, they have to learn the word draw or shade or something like that. So there's two ways you can teach this. Vocabulary is obvious. Any objects represented in the art can be represented visually through the art. And finally, grammar of all kinds. It's really endless. I see some people are saying that describing using lots of pictures really helps with language learning. Yes, and students love it as well. Thank you. Okay, next one. Okay, so speaking specifically about vocabulary words, vocabulary is art is a great way to teach vocabulary. The teacher can provide an image to illustrate and contextualize the word, or the students can create the image themselves. When students illustrate a word they're learning, they make stronger associations and they retain the information. So one example is students could draw an image that reminds them of the meaning. Another way is students could create art using the vocabulary they learned, and they'd have to use it in their final art show. They have to speak about it, they have to write about it using that vocabulary. And I'll give you an example in the next slide. Next. So this is one of my favorite graphic organizers to use for vocabulary, and some of it's not really relevant to this topic, but the point I'd like to mention is where it says word, you would write the word down that you're teaching. And if you see the box in the right-hand side where it says draw a picture, you can ask students to draw an image, a picture, anything that reminds them of this word. And again, art is very personal, and if a student creates their own image to learn a word, they're more likely to remember it because it's personal. So if you're teaching the word happy as an easy example, the student can draw a cake, and you might think, oh, there's no relation between cake and happy, but to the student there is a relation because cake makes them happy. So they're more likely to remember it. And you can use this, you can use paper, you can even use three-dimensional images to do this if you have the materials. Okay, next. Okay, so the text-art connection. I'm sure many of you are already doing this in your classrooms, but there's some ways that I'd like to explain that you might not be as familiar with. Using art to create written or spoken English is the first way. And one artwork or a series of works, it could be something that the student did or something that the teacher brings in or images that students bring into the class, can be used to do the following in both oral and written form. So they can use the art to tell a story, they can use the art to interpret or analyze, and they can describe it. Now, when they're describing or doing any of these things, you want to make sure that the written or spoken section also fulfills a language objective. Now, you can use small amounts of text, large amounts of text, or you decide depending on the level of the student. But you want to make sure that the written part, for example, a paragraph, or the spoken part, such as a presentation, fulfills a language objective and requires students to use a language that they learned before and during the art activity. You can go to the next one. Next. So here's an example of something called a Jigsaw Art Activity. You might already use this. A Jigsaw Activity is when students or a group of students are assigned a section of a reading assignment and later get together to summarize their section to their other group or classmates. So here students can first create a story using pictures, using artwork in sections, and then they or their classmates will write a section of the story based on the image. So as you can see from this story, it's a pretty basic story. Girl meets boy, boy falls in love with girl in the classroom, and the next part of the story, boy tries to win the girl's heart, but the girl's friend doesn't let him. And then finally, in the end, they do fall in love and they get married. So that's a very obvious, basic example. But look at what students can produce based on these images. They can write a full story based on, go back real quick, sorry. Go back, sorry. Go back, yep. They can write a full story just based on images. Remember I said a picture tells 1,000 words? That one image that students create in groups can be used to create a story or a section of the story based on that image. So in the end, with using the jigsaw method, they piece it all together using English and speaking in groups. And this is an obvious example of communication, of an activity that encourages communication in English in the classroom. Any questions? Okay. So this is an assignment that I love to do. It's an expository assignment where, let's say you assign a paragraph or essay. And this example, in this case with my students, I assigned a descriptive essay, and my students had to illustrate and write about their dream world. And their imagination could go crazy. They could do whatever they wanted. And as you can see here from the beautiful examples of students' dream worlds, that the possibilities are endless. But again, going back to the language objective, and the next slide. Go next. Here is an example of the first paragraph of the essay. I had my students write a full essay. This is the introduction. The language objective was they had to use the conditional tense, could and would, and that's in blue. And they had to also use adjectives that we learned in the class in their essay. So they created the image first, and they were allowed to let their imagination go crazy, go wild, and then they put it all together in written form. So as you can see, this is a great example. Again, it depends on the level. This was used for more advanced levels, but for lower levels, you could have them write sentences or just short paragraphs. So you decide. Okay, next. I'm having a hard time seeing some of your comments. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to quickly comment. Another English language fellow in Peru, Ryan Brooks. Hi, Ryan. He said for Earth Day yesterday they did a school-wide project on recycled art. In the process, teaching students the differences between folk art and fine art, using some contemporary artists as mentors. So you can see some of these students' work on the RELO Facebook page. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, so this is available on the RELO Facebook page, examples of students' art. So I hope you get a chance to check it out. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so another example, which is the reverse, is using written or spoken English to create the art. So it's sort of like illustrating the art. A text, which could be anything, a book, a poem, an essay, a paragraph, whatever. Or an oral recording, meaning it's listening, such as a conversation, a song, or even a movie, could be used to create a work of art. So some examples I gave here were class murals after reading a book. I actually did this with a class I had about 3 years ago. The students read the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but after reading, they created an entire mural about the protagonist of the story and her life. It was absolutely beautiful. A painting representing an essay, as I showed you before with the dream world. An illustration of a recorded conversation. You could have students listen to a recording, or a movie, as I said before, and you could actually have them draw or create what they're hearing. And finally, my personal favorite is, oh, go back real quick, sorry, is a fiction children's book. So you can have students write a story, a narrative story, initially, and then they have to illustrate it. Or they can illustrate it first, and then they have to write a narrative story based on their illustrations. So you decide the order that you want students to do that. So this is the opposite example of the jigsaw reading activity. It's similar to the other one I described, where students are assigned, groups of students are assigned one section of text, and then they must illustrate that text with their group members. And images naturally communicate a story, but students are required to speak in English in groups or in pairs when they're putting that story together. Remember, you might want to teach students the language they will need to communicate that story in English, and it could be language that they learn from the text itself, or you might have to teach some additional language to allow them to sort of piece this story together. And remember, with Jigsaw, they work in groups, and then they communicate to other groups what the section of the text that they read, or within the same group you can assign each student a section, and then you can also assign each student an image or an art activity based on that reading, and then they have to communicate to their group members what they read, and in the end they have a final version in text form and in art form. Okay, you can move on to the next page. So I'm sure many of you already use games in the language classroom. Games are so useful to practice almost any language activity. I love using games. And I especially love guessing games. They're really effective because they make the activity more interesting. They require students to listen to get information, and they sort of create that feeling of suspense, which always makes things more fun. You know, when you watch a movie and it's suspenseful, it's more fun. So an example would be the teacher or students giving an oral description of a student's work. Let's say that they post their work throughout the classroom. There's an oral description, and using listening skills, the rest of the class has to guess whose work it is. Or students could write a written description about their work, and they might switch the description with other students in the class, and their classmates read the descriptions and then match them to the artwork. So it's using listening skills, reading skills. Another one is a classroom competition for the best story based on a classmate's work or a student's own work. And they can sort of compete for who writes the best story or the most accurate story. Another game I like, you can use it for images or for writing, is the running dictation game. And that's where you form groups of students and post artwork on the walls. And then one student from each group runs to look at a picture, and then that student sort of runs back to the group and describes the image, describes the artwork to their group mates in English. And their group mates must listen and then draw what they hear, or it could be dictation where they have to write down what they hear and then later transfer that to an image that they draw. So it's a really fun way, and this is one of my favorites. And the next slide is similar to that. As you can see, these very funny caricatures of Obama, Che Guevara, and Michael Jackson, very famous people. I really like something called the blind listening game, sort of similar to the running dictation, but usually I like to put students in pairs with their backs to each other. they can't see each other. And one student has an image or an artwork, the other student has a blank sheet of paper, and then one student has to describe this image, and the other student has to listen, but they can't see it. And so again, they're using listening skills and speaking skills to describe this. And then at the end, they sort of match up the paper to see if it's similar. So you have to make sure that you're teaching this language so students are able to perform this activity effectively. Another example is Art Pictionary, which is students have to draw an image and the rest have to guess what it is in English. And I wanted to make a comment about the caricatures. It's really good for more advanced students, or if you have a group of students and in each group you have a stronger artist, and each group competes for who can guess the identity of the caricature first. So let's say you all give them a photo of Obama, and the rest of the group mates have to describe what Obama looks like, but they can't say who it is, and then the artist has to draw it, and the first artist to guess the identity of the person, that's the winning group, as an example. So it depends on the level, but I did this with a group of teenagers and they absolutely loved it. Next, please. Next. So I don't know if you have this in your countries when you were a child, but this was one of my favorite games I used to love as a kid. It's called Where's Waldo? As you can see, Waldo with the red and white striped shirt on the side, and it's usually an image packed with other things, and it's very hard to find Waldo. You can use an image like this to simply teach the objects in it or grammar related to it, or you can put students in pairs and groups, and then one has to explain where Waldo is without revealing too much information. So as you can barely see from that, and I could barely see without my glasses, that is, I believe that is Waldo in the center of the image, but he's sort of hiding behind the other people. So it's, again, a good way to teach speaking and listening skills. Next. Okay, so how should we select appropriate dual art and language activities? Moving on. Next. Okay, so make sure you choose your language or content objective, especially language objective. So think carefully about what language point you want the art activity to teach or practice, and use art activities that will allow students to meet that objective. Always consider your ultimate course goals. So if your goal is to improve conversation, you might want to have more speaking and listening activities. But if it's a regular class, I would suggest incorporating a combination of reading, writing, listening, and speaking activities. Next. Next. Thanks. Okay, make sure you also plan for assessment. So you want to distinguish between informal and formal assessment. Informal assessment is when the teacher frequently checks to make sure the students are understanding the material. It's not graded, it's happening all the time in the classroom. Whereas formal assessment is something that the teacher grades that students must plan for and possibly practice or study for. So that could be the summative presentation or show could be an example of that, and that should demonstrate all the skills, all the learned skills, English skills. And always think, how will you ask students to use artwork to show the language they have learned? And what exactly will students be able to do by the end of the lesson? Every time you're planning a lesson, think about that. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to give you an example of some art-related language objectives. Students will be able to, in terms of speaking and vocabulary, students will be able to use descriptive adjectives to orally compare and contrast a painting created of their hometown to a photo of a city in the USA. A grammar and writing objective. Students will be able to use the present simple tense and present progressive verb tenses to write what is happening in their painting in a short paragraph. Listening objectives. Students will be able to listen to an oral description of a painting in the room given by an instructor or teacher, and based on what he or she hears, identify the painting the instructor is referring to. So they have to listen. Well, what? Okay. Oh, it's that work right there. Oh, okay. So those are some examples of specific specific language objectives for an art and a dual art and language art classroom. And make sure that you always consider carefully the materials you will need beforehand, because as we know, art can be messy depending on the materials you use. Always consider time. I've found that things, well, in general with teaching, but especially with art activities, they usually take longer than planned, so keep that in mind. Class size, the bigger the class, the more difficult it will be to organize the activity, so keep it simple in many cases, especially if it's a larger class. Student age, younger students benefit from different kinds of artwork. They for example, finger painting, and they tend to prefer more literal art as opposed to older students who may be more inclined to like abstract work, like Picasso, for example. So keep in mind that older students also have stronger motor skills to do more complex work. And also, obviously, English proficiency is always something to consider. Okay, next. Next. Okay, so I wanted to quickly describe a successful English art hybrid pilot class in action in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. You can move on to the next one. That's a picture of me standing among my students in front of the City Hall in Buffalo. When I was teaching English classes in public schools, I noticed that many of these students were incredible artists but had very low English proficiency. And I wanted to use art to allow them to express themselves in English. And I was very lucky. I got a grant to fund an 8-week painting class for 3 hours once a week. And at the end of the 8 weeks, students presented an art show in English to the community. And we even earned some money because it was a fundraiser. And it was really amazing to see students come out of their shells. And at the beginning of every class, I had a 30-minute mini lesson teaching an aspect of English that was required for their artwork that day. They learned vocabulary, colors, shapes, prepositions, adjectives, present progressive tense, past simple tense, etc. And they had to use all of this language in their art show while describing their work. It was really amazing. So next slide, please. Next slide. As you can see in this slide, that's some students in action. And go back real quick. And that's some of the best examples of their work. They were very strong in art, and they were asked to paint something that reminded them of their hometown, as I mentioned before. That's why I used that example. So it was really rewarding, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. So how could you use the following artwork in your classroom? I'm interested in hearing some of your ideas as they come in. I'm going to move a little closer so I can read. What are some ways that a student could use the following works of art to learn and practice English? Now let's assume the students are creating this work, or the teacher could bring the work to the classroom. So what are some ways? Anyone have anything to share? If not, I'll just guess what you might say. Okay, well I can leave the comments for the end if we have some time. So I would say colors, animals, shapes, family members, endless. There's so many things you could teach. That's just some of the things that come to mind at the moment. You can go to the next one. That's actually a painting that I did of a scene in Japan, based on a place where I live. And what do you think are some ways that you could use this to learn and practice English? Anyone have anything to share? Well, there's the obvious examples like, you know, trees, the vocabulary in the image, colors. Another thing is this work is sort of mysterious, and you could use it to generate a discussion. You know, what's at the end of that road, for example? Where is it going? What is it leading to? Who's looking at it? So it can be very literal, or it can be very abstract, and it really depends on the age and level of the students as well. So moving on. Okay, so I don't know if we're going to have time to fully discuss this, but I wanted to make a point that we only see the world through our own personal and cultural glasses. And art, as I said before, is a representation of the culture. So really quickly, which object doesn't belong with the others? I mean, just take a quick look. First thing that comes to your head. Okay, next. Sorry, I'm moving a little bit faster. When I practiced this before, it only took 40 minutes. So if you chose the log, you have more of a logical or abstract focus because you're looking at the category of things and it's not a tool like the other three. If you chose the axe, it's the only object that's not made of wood, that doesn't contain wood, so you have a physical materials focus. If you choose the hammer, you have more of a useful, practical focus because you can't use the hammer with the other three things, but you can use the saw and the axe to cut the log. And finally, let's say you have a negative emotional memory of getting hurt by a saw as a child. The first thing, your first reaction will be emotional because you see the saw, you want to take it out of the group. So people can respond to things in emotional ways as well, as we know. Okay, next. So my point that I wanted to make about this was that every student views and understands an image using their own personal logic, and that's affected by a student's background, class, culture, age, gender, and it affects how students interpret and create an image. So always use this to your advantage when using art to teach English. Personal interpretations are the key to communicative language expression. Excuse me. Next. I want to move on. You can skip that one. Next. Okay, so you can also use art. You can use pop art, famous works from different cultures, and you can use them for a cultural discussion. So students can analyze culture through art, as you can see from this graffiti in Bogota, or this Snow White smoking a cigarette, or the famous American pop artist Andy Warhol with the Campbell's soup. Very cultural images, and you can also have students create art representing their own culture and then compare it with art from other cultures, as you can see here. Okay, next. Next. Again, you can have students read a text about culture first, and then they can illustrate it in art form. For example, reading about line dancing in the cowboys in the upper right-hand corner, or reading about the typical suburban household in sort of representing the American dream in the United States. Next. Okay, so really quickly, how could you use the following artwork in your classroom for cultural discussions? Next. Okay, so this is a picture of a typical suburban home in the United States, and in the lower right-hand corner is a typical Ecuadorian house. So what are some similarities and differences, and how do these images reflect the culture of both societies? And that could be a wonderful discussion about culture. Any quick ideas? I know we're sort of running out of time here. Any ideas? The first thing that comes to mind for me is the gate. You can see the American house is very far back from the street, and but it's also open at the same time. And the Ecuadorian house it's got the gates right there in front, right on the street. And what could you say about that? My first reaction would be, well, what about American culture makes them not have gates in front of their entire house, as opposed to Ecuadorians? And it's a really interesting discussion. Okay, you can move on. Not seeing too many comments coming in. Hopefully we have a couple minutes for questions at the end. So now going back to this agree or disagree. Do you agree or disagree about any of these comments? If you still have questions, comments about any of these statements, feel free to ask me now, or any other questions related to this webinar. Any comments coming in, questions? Anything you disagree with on this slide, or disagree with something that I said, or something to add? No comments? Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Next, please. Okay, this is a great resource. It's called Create to Communicate, Art Activities for English as a Foreign Language Classroom. And the entire ebook is available on the AmericanEnglishState.gov website. I absolutely love this book because it has a lot of very concrete ideas. Many ideas I didn't even share with you today due to lack of time, but I would highly suggest going here. This is the link, direct link to the ebook, so feel free to check it out. Next. So thank you. If you have any more questions or comments to add, feel free to ask me now. Okay, I'm going to move on to my contact slide. If you have any more questions that you want to ask at the last minute, feel free. Excuse me, that's my references. My contact info, that's my website right there. This presentation will be available on my website, and I believe it's also available on the RELO website. It will be a PDF version, so it should be accessible from any computer, and it will be on my, where it says Amy's Professional Blog. Anything related to my presentations are in that link. Also, if you go to resources on my website, there is an endless variety of downloadable documents and English learning websites that you can use with your students, and also teacher resources. So you're more than welcome to use anything from there. And as always, the Shaping the Way We Teach English website has tons of English language learning activities and ideas, as well as the American English website. So feel free to check it out anytime. And if you have any questions, my contact information is on my website. So if not, you can ask now. I did get a comment from someone. If we could go back to the agree or disagree. Somebody mentioned that they disagree with number 1. If we could go back to the agree or disagree slide. Yes, she disagreed that it's a waste of time to use visual arts, and I fully agree. And you know, she mentioned that students can enjoy and share their knowledge and likes, and it's very, very true. There's anything that supports language learning, even if it might take a little longer than you expect or would hope, it's not a waste of time. And the time they're spending contextualizing the language, remember, they're learning, they're retaining the information, and they're not going to forget it 5 minutes later, like with a lot of more rote learning, memory-based activities. So thank you. I agree. Any other comments or questions? No more comments. Okay. Well, I think we'll stop there now, and we're out of time, so it sort of worked out perfectly. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and until next time, thank you.